Spider-Man is one of the most iconic characters of all time and the poster boy for the biggest brand in the world, Marvel. First originating in comics, he's been present in so many different iterations, from big blockbuster movies, plenty of animated shows, and of course a lot of video games. There never before has been really an iconic version of Spidey in a video game though. Lots of lackluster movie tie-in games, or plenty of others that explore different aspects of the Spider-Man mythos. And while some of these have been pretty decent, they usually always come up lacking in one of three: story, traversal, or combat. After the old contract with Activision and Marvel ended, Marvel began looking for a new partner, one that wanted to faithfully adapt the character into a video game, in a definitive way similar to the way Rocksteady had done with the Batman Arkham games. And they found their partners with PlayStation and the development studio, Insomniac. And really, video games are a perfect place for these characters to go. As kids, we grew up mesmerized by their abilities, and the fact that they use them for the good and betterment of others. And what better way to experience these abilities in the most kinetic and tactile way possible? Reading them in comics, watching them in TV or movies is great, but there's no better way to experience these stories than feeling like your favorite superhero. And this is very personal for me too. Spider-Man has always been my favorite fictional character, ever since I was little. His binding moral code, his everyman figure, his abilities to be unique and spectacular while not overpowering, the balance between his real life and superhero life. It's very personal for a lot of people too, which is why so many different interpretations of the character exist. Whether it be through the different live action or animated movies, the animated shows, or even specific iterations from the comics, part of the beauty of this character is how many people have had their interpretations realized, how many different iterations of the character there is. And while not all are as good as the other, the fact so many people get to add theirs is part of what makes this character amazing, and that's what Insomniac did here, adding their own unique interpretation of this legendary character's mythos.
Well, May's always told me if you help someone,
you help everyone.
1 month! In 1 month you'll wish you had me back!
But Dr. Octavius's work will help millions. I'm right where I want to be, right where I should be. You know, the closer you get to them, the more you become a target, right?
The closer I get, the better chance we have to stop them.
5 years ago, you walked in here and told me you were inspired by my mission to help others. Now it's you who inspires me.
It only affects the muscles. The mind continues to work, but it can no longer do.
Finally.
Sorry I'm late. It's kind of my thing. You know, anytime. Didn't you tell me something once about accepting that I'm human just like everyone else?
You and Ben. Masters at turning my own words against me.
He's right. The city is in danger. It needs our help.
All of our help.
All right, well, call the play, coach.
From the very beginning of this game alone, we see how this interpretation is different. We're starting on an older Peter, living by himself in a shambles of an apartment, emphasizing an amazing quote from the Spider-Man 2 film, "Brilliant but lazy." Peter's past relationships with his parents, MJ, Harry, and Aunt May are highlighted through the photos he has up. One recurring theme throughout the gameplay and story is how tech and science orientated this Peter is. Even from these first shots, so many different gadgets and designs throughout his apartment and the tech and the mask, and I love the automatic toaster he's built. The current MCU Spider-Man gets a lot of criticism for being very tech orientated and less everyman, but I feel it's an element that makes Peter unique, and I love how it's not just incorporated, but heavily utilized in the gameplay and storytelling in this game. We see the newspapers from previous villains he's fought, Vulture, Rhino, Electro, and others. This Peter not only has a history of himself, but also as Spider-Man. He already has a strong reputation and presence throughout the city. We aren't guiding that journey, we're jumping into it. Quite literally, as the first gameplay we get is him jumping out of Peter's window right into New York in his classic suit, and here we get the first bit of web-slinging. Web-slinging is really the lifeblood that this game runs on, because without an engaging web-slinging mechanic to traverse New York, honestly, what's the point of a Spider-Man game at all? And web slinging in this game feels like the thing Insomniac focused on the most in the gameplay aspect, as it feels really well refined and thought out. It's really easy to pick up, as the tutorial shows. A simple hold R2 will take you from point A to point B quite simply, with Spidey looking great while doing it. But other than this, there's so much more to explore if you really want to, and this opens up throughout the game, largely through the skill tree which increases these abilities. I beeline for the web slinging upgrades as soon as I could. While R2 swing is the bedrock foundation of this system, is elevated by all the other options that you have. Being able to jump at the end of a swing and manually decide on your next one, as if you hold R2 you will swing to wherever the game decides is best. But you can manually choose to press instead, which gives control and agency back to the player, for them to decide when it's best for them to swing. Being able to seamlessly go into a wall run from swinging or jumping and then back out of it. Being able to web zip horizontally across or up over the edge of a building, and to point launch. The basis to what makes this system so engaging is momentum. New York is a gridded structure with many variations in the height of buildings. Traversing New York, combining all the mechanics you have, is what makes the system magic. To use every tool at your disposal to increase and maintain your momentum, so that buildings fly past, so you weave through wide streets, narrow alleys, or over the top of buildings. The fantasy of playing as Spider-Man would be entirely lacking without a strong traversal system, which Insomniac have really nailed here. The web stick to actual objects and buildings, it feels tactile and grounded. While certainly being exaggerated and impossible, many of the moves, there's still an element of realism. There aren't too many or too little individual moves that can be combined either. They all make sense and work together. From a quick recovery and wall cornering to point launches and web zips. They take a few tries to get used to, but once you have, combining these to master the ability to bring Spidey to life. The web slinging certainly has a skill gap, but it's not unapproachable, and while I wouldn't say it's hard to master, it certainly takes time, trial, and error to be efficient at it. Something to work through throughout the game, as late game web slinging is so much more engaging than the early game, as these mechanics and abilities open up, but also as you get better at them. The other aspect to this is the city of New York. In this game we only get the main area of Manhattan, and New York is the perfect place mostly for web slinging, as the sheer amount of tall buildings in this game, but the significant problem for almost any Spider-Man game is Central Park. A huge area of New York where the height of the trees is the highest point. Not ideal for web slinging, and honestly, web slinging isn't even essential here. It still works, and it's very lenient and forgiving when attaching to trees, which helps, but the web zip, jump, and point launch are all more than enough to make moving through Central Park, although very different, still great in its own right, which really points to how great this is mechanically, that even with the primary swing not being well utilised in this area, it's still a great place to traverse. The one downside to this system, arguably, is that of speed, as older Spider-Man games had significantly faster web slinging, which, while this is disappointing and more base speed would be appreciated, I would argue this is largely a hardware limitation of being built for the PS4 with its mechanical hard drives, and having New York be so detailed in a way that it wasn't in previous games. The sequel looks to improve upon this issue. Utilising the PS5's SSD, we can see much faster speed in the web slinging from the gameplay we've seen. But I would also argue that movement being slower emphasises how important that skill gap between players who are able to build and maintain the momentum is, compared to players who aren't, and the differences in experiences between them. With most games, I'm very much a complete my playthrough, uninstall, and move on. I rarely ever come back to games, and if I do, it's almost always for a complete full playthrough. But this game, I always have it installed, because sometimes I just get the itch to jump in and swing around New York, and no matter how many times I do, I never get sick or bored of it. For the start of this game, we jump right into some action, with an iconic Spider-Man villain, Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, is being arrested by the police, and his men are resisting their siege on Fisk Tower. So it's up to Spidey to infiltrate and take him down, which he does. This section is really linear and acts as a tutorial in the basic mechanics, web slinging over there, and once there, combat, wall crawling, and much more. But it also gives context to the history of this Spider-Man and world. Fisk has been the largest player for a long time. His downfall has not only been the goal for Peter for a while, but his arrest is the catalyst and the inciting incident for this game story-wise. But before the crux of this story can get underway, we need to be introduced to some of the key characters for this story and their motivation. And by far the most important is this iteration of Peter, aka Spider-Man. This Peter is older than when we typically jump into his story as a teenager. In his mid-20s, he's still quite young, but has enough experience behind him that he has developed into his own. A bit of a debate is about what truly represents Spider-Man. Certain quotes by Stan Lee has been that the iconic beauty of Spider-Man is the fact anyone can be behind the mask. I certainly believe that's a huge factor, and why a huge amount of this game, and arguably too much, has Peter under his mask. But I don't think this applies at all to Peter Parker. Peter has a series of set character traits, positives and negatives, that make him who he is. And while I'm all for different interpretations, and there never being a set definitive version of Peter or Spider-Man, there are general characteristics that I believe should be there. The hardship he deals with, the Parker luck, and how the quote, "with great power comes great responsibility," is a guiding principle in his life. Peter is a character and should be treated as such, and not just a vessel for Spider-Man to exist and plant yourself onto. While there's certainly an element of that is healthy within this character, I believe Peter Parker brings a lot of value to Spider-Man, and vice versa. And for Insomniac's representation, they've nailed how Spidey guides his principles, and how he is always trying to help literally everyone, and how often this comes at a sacrifice for Peter. Whether through MJ, Aunt May, his work with Otto, the choice between Peter and Spidey is one he constantly has to make, and almost always chooses Spidey, as that will help the most people. This Peter is hugely tech-focused. This works so well in a few distinctive ways. First is a gameplay sense, as gadgets and abilities Peter gains from his work on his Spidey tech adds a great amount of options for the player on top of his base ability. While arguably his base abilities are enough to carry the game, in situations like combat, the amount of options these gadgets provides is essential to not feeling stale. On top, it is hugely influential in the narrative, as Peter works with Otto Octavius, working on robotics, which is not only a huge design and practical influence for the game and where the story goes, but contrasts entirely Norma's work with biology. It gives the gameplay more variety and gives Peter more structure within this world. We're also quickly introduced to Yuri Watanabe, a police captain close to Spidey, and they work together a lot. We see glimpses of Yuri's character throughout the game, very similar goals to Spidey to help out New York by reducing crime, and clearly seeing the benefit of Spider-Man, even if it may be controversial within her department. And particularly, we see glimpses of banter and jesting between the two. But really, Yuri honestly acts through most of the game as more of a practical information device than a character really. She doesn't have much of an arc, and more communicates with Spidey when he needs specific information for the next objective. This is until the DLC. Otto Octavius, I would argue, is Spider-Man's second most iconic villain behind Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. And we begin with Otto's journey as a mentor to Peter, and as his employer. We quickly learn Otto is a man who is doing his best to replace limbs through robotics, and though he relies on grants for funding, Peter sees the goodness in Otto and the ability to make a difference for the better, not just through Spider-Man but also through Peter. We're introduced to one of the most iconic characters from the Spider-Man mythos, Mary Jane Watson, as she attempts to steal a file from Wilson Fisk's art collection. And Mary Jane is wildly different. She's one of 3 playable characters in the game, and honestly almost acts nothing like MJ in any other interpretation. In this, she is a reporter for the Daily Bugle and has a huge amount of Lois Lane energy, getting herself into danger as exposing the story is what she believes will bring down the bad guys through information. Peter and MJ have a previous romantic relationship that broke down largely due to Peter being too protective of her and not trusting her to put herself into dangerous situations and get herself out. Which I understand both sides. She doesn't have the abilities Peter does, but MJ wants to be treated like an equal by Peter, which she feels he doesn't. Another issue I have with this version of MJ is her relationship with Peter. The Peter-MJ dynamic is so critical and important to the comics, but in this game it feels far more of a relationship between MJ and Spider-Man, as so much of the story of them together is investigating and doing things as reporter and Spider-Man. The relationship between these two people outside of their work feels completely underdeveloped. Overall though, I'm mixed on this interpretation for MJ. As for me, the core traits of the character from the comics and other iterations aren't really present here much at all, but at the same time I'm always open to new and unique takes, and I do quite like the arc that her and Peter go through throughout the game. Aunt May is quite a unique character from the other ones, was always Peter's last living relative, and represents a lot of his pre-Spider-Man life. What shocked me about Aunt May on this replay is how much of an important and integral figure in the game she is remembered as, but comparatively to a lot of other characters has very little screen time. This Aunt May is the guiding principle that influences Peter in his work, through Otto and Spider-Man and helping others. Throughout the game she is completely dedicated to helping the less fortunate through her work at Feast, and has some of the most sincere and thoughtful dialogue guiding Peter through his journey. As Fisk exits to prison, he warns Spidey he doesn't know what he's unleashed, and shortly after we see rumbles of a new player in the space. Through the masked men attacking Fisk's art auction, to the Shocker situation, new crimes begin ramping up. To investigate this, Peter takes the mask to Martin Lee, May's boss at Feast, and he immediately seems distracted and worried upon seeing this. Lee dubs this mask that of a demon, and that's what this new threat within New York becomes known as, the Demons. Spidey ends up rendezvousing with the cop Jefferson Davis, finding out the demons appear to be going after Fisk's old equipment and locations, arming themselves for something. One thing that really impresses me about the world they built here in Spider-Man is how everything is relevant and reinforced by what is happening in the main narrative. The narrative is the bedrock in which every other aspect, including the side content, is based upon. Even the time of day is not on a cycle and is completely linked to wherever you are in the main story. As well as, when you go through the world swinging around, J. Jonah Jameson's podcast will play, commenting obviously very negatively on recent things you've done as Spidey, which is not only great in keeping with Marvel lore, but is also reminding the player that Spidey's actions have consequences and reactions from the everyday people in New York. The first activities to open up to us though are the police towers. This is mainly practical as it's this game's version of the traditional Ubisoft formula of unlocking a section of the map to see other objects, but this always reinforces Spidey's cooperation with the police in this game and how fundamental that is to the main story. The second is the backpacks. These backpacks are still webbed up all over New York from years ago, and while they're just collectibles, they're so interesting in organically showing the history of this world. We see information from even Peter's high school days and the foreshadowing of the situation with Harry. Other fun moments such as first dates and first web fluid are Spider-Man plushie things that just make this world feel more alive and lived in. The gloves we needed to fight Electro. Not only does Peter have a history, but so does Spider-Man. We see information from villains that never appear in this game, such as Lizard, Sandman, and Mysterio, as well as the greater Marvel references, such as a card from a particularly blind lawyer. Landmarks are another ones that act mainly as a collectible, taking photos of iconic places within New York. This is a reference to Peter's history as a photographer, but also grounds the environment based on real life locations, for a bit of digital tourism, but is also based on places within the Marvel Universe, such as the Sanctum Sanctorum, Avengers Tower, and other iconic Marvel locations, make this world feel more varied. The crimes are probably the most prevalent and relevant to Spidey. These are dynamic events that happen throughout the world with a bunch of basic crimes, such as stolen cars, muggings, and more. What I really like about these is how they evolve. At the start of the game, they're simply random thugs doing these. When the demons emerge, they have the demon crimes and continued with the convict and sable ones. Not only are these relevant to the main story, but they're also a form of difficulty, as the later ones are generally harder than the earlier ones. There are also side missions in this game. They almost all revolve around helping individuals, such as the wives whose husbands caught up in some dangerous activities, the ones with the ESU students being possessed by the demons, or the most memorable for me is a series of ones to take down Tombstone. And these, I feel, are the most lacking, as so many smaller side stories could be gleaned from this and seen with, as done with the Tombstone one. But mostly, they're just sort of largely forgettable. I do understand the focus on the main narrative though. Suit customization exists largely as a reward for doing lots of this side content. And personally, I'm a person who likes to play in the canon way, so I spent most of my time in the advanced suit. But really, the sheer amount of customization being able to play as in the Raimi suit, various suits from the MCU, Bombastic Bagman, Spider-Man 2099, is so amazing and a real quality fan service, as well as they also hold back on suits that will be important for future games, such as Miles or the Symbiote. There's a couple other activities based around miscellaneous tasks. The Black Cat stakeouts are really just a tease of the character of Black Cat and the DLC. The pigeons are Spidey helping out a citizen with some annoying web-slinging challenge. And then there's Taskmaster challenges, based around different aspects like stealth combat and web-slinging, so that Taskmaster can learn Spidey's moves and eventually face off against him. I particularly enjoyed these, as they provided a slight challenge while also referencing greater Marvel lore with Taskmaster. The last of these is the research stations. These exist through New York and are the primary characterization we get of what I can only assume to be a hugely important character in the future games, Harry Osborn. Harry is in Europe, or so Peter thinks, and these research stations were his mother's before she died, and Harry wants Peter to prove their usefulness so that they can get more funding from Oscorp and not shut down. They involve various miscellaneous tasks to help with pollution and other issues plaguing New York, and they show Harry's love for his mother and his belief in their defining responsibility to help people. And lastly is the outposts. These are combat orientated and similar to the crimes where different ones open up based on the story. First is Fisk, then demons, then convicts, and then Sable. All of these relate back to the main story, but are once again also difficulty setting. They are closed off areas with wave-based groups of enemies and additional challenges to boot. This aspect is where I feel the combat is brought out and where it truly shines the most. Combat is the second most action you do in the game, behind web swinging, and it's hugely important to how the pace and feel of the game plays. It's largely inspired by beat-em-ups or brawlers, with particular influence from the Batman Arkham games, in that Batman feels visceral without being deadly. And they go for a similar approach here. Peter's hits pack a punch, and there's a satisfying feel and noise when they connect, but he isn't using deadly force. This combined with the animations of Spidey nimbly jumping over, under or around enemies, off and on walls, webbing and swinging up, makes it feel acrobatic. And using Spidey's moves against enemies, a few of the basic mechanics that work with these are obvious, and the simple hit with square, the web strike with triangle, jump with X, and dodge with circle, which is complemented nicely with the Spidey Sense mechanic, and R1 to use your gadget to web up enemy, temporarily making them unable to move. Throughout the game, more of these moves unlock being able to yank and swing enemies and objects, disarming enemies, off-the-wall attacks and others. Being an important aspect to this, the combo meter. The higher the combo of enemies without being hit, leads to a faster charge rate of your focus. And focus can be used on two different elements, either to heal yourself or on a finisher for the enemy, paired with an animation to take that enemy in one hit. Another charge meter of this suitability is that they aren't tied to any suit and can be mixed and matched to have a plethora of other abilities to suit your playstyle. Many different ones are focused on combat, some on recharging focus, and others on stealth. It allows for so much player choice and variety. Another aspect to this is the gadgets. There are 8 gadgets in total that can be assigned to R1 through the weapon wheel. Weapon wheels, I feel, are such an underrated aspect of video games, as it appears that so many developers are trying hard to avoid them, and I feel like this is a mistake. Weapon wheels are a bit annoying. In fact, it stops the flow and gives you the menu, but what you gain on-the-spot choice is so much more important. Attempts to assign these instead to a D-pad, like in God of War, are really limiting to 4 simple choices. We here double the amount exist, and it's all the better for it. Also, the gadgets themselves provide variety. A lot are based on immobilizing enemy through basic webs, electric webs, and web bombs and suspension matrix. It stops enemies in their track, allowing more time and to open up a way to deal with them. Others, such as trip mines and impact webs, usually allow to quickly take down enemies in one shot, while the drone acts as a companion independently staggering enemies, and the concussion blast, well, I just love to use that to push enemies off of buildings. The gadgets are also very limited, with most having only 4 and will only recharge from doing other things in combat. This is of course except for the basic web, which is meant to pretty much be available whenever. Stealth is another aspect of this combat system. It's quite simplistic and largely involves Spidey being high up and webbing up or knocking out enemies that are by themselves. There are tools to make enemies move away from each other, or using gadgets like trip mines to quickly web up one, but using too many of these in quick succession raises suspicion. While it's simplistic, it's consistent and clear, with lots of visual language to communicate if an enemy can see you, or if it's safe to take one out, and I do appreciate that aspect. A stealth system can be anything but inconsistent. Combat isn't the shining star addictive action like the web slinging is, but it's engaging, and that's really all I can ask for. The main story in this game brilliantly encapsulates all the different directions in Peter's life, how they tear him from the other, but also how they are deeply connected together, and how neglect in one area can result in horrific consequences for the other. I would say there's 3 different stories going on that all intersect. Peter and his job working with Otto Octavius, Peter and his relationship with Aunt May and helping her at Feast, and Peter and his work as Spider-Man, which is largely focused around the demons and working with MJ and Yuri. Things seem quite calm in the first act. After putting Fisk away, there's some stuff to clean up as Spidey, and some weird people in demon masks, stealing some things, but ultimately things seem balanced. He's working with Otto to help change the world, but Norman is hindering that as much as he can. Him and May have such admiration and respect for one another, and he starts to slowly start things up with MJ again. Throughout the early sections of the game, we're simply learning about this world, while events are happening in the background. Peter's relationships, his work as Spider-Man, the context of it all. The narrative really kicks into gear though, when at a rally for Mayor Norman Osborn, where Jefferson Davis, the cop who recently worked with Spidey, is being honoured. This is a plot from the demons, who blow up the event, killing Davis and others, and injuring many more. One of these is Peter, who attended as himself to watch Davis, who saved him, as Spidey, be honoured. He is unable to save him, and thus we play as Davis' son, Miles. Miles Morales is a character who has absolutely jumped in popularity in recent years. He was popular in the comics for his inception, his awesome looking suit and his personality being the star, sharing enough traits from Peter to more than being able to take up the mantle, but also enough differences to not be cast in Peter's shadow. Miles is personally a very important character for me, as his first issue is the first physical comic I ever bought, though this Miles we get to know him way before he gets bitten by a spider. Here Miles is shown to be determined, brave in the face of adversity, a huge Spider-Man fan, and someone seeking to make the world better, not waiting for other people to do it, clearly inspired a lot by his father and also by Spider-Man. Playing as him though is not great. And playing as MJ has the same problem. Playing as Spider-Man is so fast, fluid, and fun, and MJ and Miles are practically the opposite. They're slow in these drawn-out stealth sections, and while I see what they're going with, making the expanding characters feel more impactful, adding a sense of powerlessness to appreciate Peter's powers more, but especially in replays, they stop the fun in their tracks. For Miles at least, I will say it gets some payoff since he literally gets his own game as Spider-Man. And while this may be controversial, with this MJ already being so different, I feel like her becoming her own version of Spider-Woman in a future game would be awesome. The bombing that kills Jefferson Davis leads to a very somber section of the game. Peter convinces Aunt May to have Miles work at Feast to help him with his grief, and with an almost a vengeance he goes after the demons as Spider-Man. It's at this point in the story the demons become a major focus. We know they're behind these acts now, and have emerged to take Fisk's place in a much more obvious and violent way. The bombing also revealed who the primary antagonist at this point is, Martin Lee, leading Peter to investigating his office, finding Lee's negative powers and his hatred for one person in particular, Norman Osborn. Norman Osborn in this game is used wonderfully. Norman is seemingly sleazy and a careless multi-millionaire, putting others at risk for his profit. He's rude, vindictive, and manipulative. A villain in most senses of the word. But he's not irrational, as the other villains in this game are that hate him. He's not after hurting people to prove a point. Norman Osborn and his eventual return to the Green Goblin is Spider-Man's most iconic antagonist for a reason. As Norman Osborn, he is terrifying through his influence, his reach, and his ability to manipulate things behind the scenes. And as the Green Goblin, he's terrifying in a whole new way, letting the Goblin come forth and be the maniac he is. Lex Luthor and the Joker in one. We see Norman's negative effect first come through Otto, as he takes away his grant and funding as Oscorp is working on competitor tech. We find out both still hold a grudge for each other, as they both built Oscorp, but Otto left due to disagreeing with Norman's methods. Meanwhile, we find out about the MacGuffin, as every good superhero story needs. This is Devil's Breath, and Oscorp developed potential cure for biological disease, particularly one Harry's mum and Norman's wife died of. And well, in its current state, it's more of a bioweapon, able to unleash a deadly plague on New York and potentially the world. This is Lee's and the Demon's whole plan, to release Devil's Breath, have a pandemic take over New York, and have it be known Norman and Oscorp is responsible, to sink the company and him. We learn Norman has made New York reliant on Oscorp, with power, water, sewage, and others. So, to hurt one is to hurt the other. We get the introduction of another character here, Silver Sable, Eastern European mercenary owner, and hired by Norman Osborn has his own personal guard. Here, Sable is cold, violent, and out to get Spider-Man. Though through his actions in the game, it forces her to reevaluate her own stance, and instead of fighting for profit, fighting for others who can't and need it. This is explored more in the DLC. Act 2 is where the narrative really finds its footing and goes at full pace. All we've established in Act 1 is being expanded upon and pushing these characters further. The death of Jefferson Davis pushes characters like Peter, MJ, and Miles and the player into focusing and caring about the demons in their plot. A tangible loss motivates this. While elements like May, Otto, and Norman are in the background, the demons and the hunt for Lee become the primary point, and Peter is focusing on this. And we start to see Otto slip and May become more worried. This is the primary motivator for Act 2. The demons getting hold of trying to release Devil's Breath and Spidey and MJ attempting to stop them and actually being successful. But not all good things can last. While Spidey stops Lee and sends him to prison, very quickly a commotion there happens with a massive breakout, and all of Spidey's old enemies, Electro, Rhino, Scorpion, Vulture, Mr. Negative, and eventually the primary antagonist of this game is revealed, Doc Ock, and they all show up to form the Sinister Six. Now, this was kind of obvious. We've slowly seen and helped Otto through the course of the game improve his tech, but simultaneously he's been deteriorating, having a condition where his body is failing him, leading to Otto desperately need his tech to work out. Not just to help others, but also himself. Meanwhile, he's been getting more angry and violent as we watch Otto go from the brilliant mentor Peter knew to the monster he eventually becomes. While Peter is watching his mentor deteriorate from the first time we meet Otto, there's an ominous feeling for the player. We see as the demon commotion picks up, and Peter feels like he needs to dedicate more time as Spider-Man. His other job is becoming a problem, particularly in Otto, and Peter recognizes this, but ultimately neglects him. This successful assault on the prison, and Ock and the others being able to take down Spidey, leads to Otto letting Devil's Breath loose, and Act 3 taking place in a New York that feels like it's from an apocalypse. A pandemic so everyone has to stay inside, prisoners newly freed roaming the streets, and Sable acting like a totalitarian force. This is also reflected in the gameplay, where even more than random crimes, you can randomly be sniped and shot at through traversing the world. Cars and pedestrians are scarce, there's an ominous danger to the world. I find the motivation for our two primary villains so interesting. Both Lee and Otto are almost single-handedly motivated into their villainous actions by Norman Osborn. Everybody hates Norman. He is the primary force behind their anger and behaviors, and what's so interesting about this, honestly, in Spider-Man stories is usually either a mad scientist's dream of a better world or a personal hatred to Spidey himself. Norman here represents something so much bigger. The power he has over New York, being mayor, is subtle enough, but still blatantly obvious. He represents so many of the continuing bad parts about it. How much he is connected to and controls the city's vital infrastructure. How he is more than willing to work with crime lords like Fisk. How he shuts down Otto's research for his own profit. And how every good action he does uses for fuel for his mayor campaign. And for Otto and Lee, the same event is what caused their hatred of him. In an effort to cure his wife, Norman experiments with different technologies to save her. This eventually leads to Devil's Breath, but years before that, Martin's parents accept to use him for a trial of another kind, one that does kill Martin but leaves him with the powers of Mr. Negative. Oh, and it kills his parents in the process. So for Lee, very understandable why he hates Norman. And for Otto, it feels like he betrayed him, as Otto helped with this unknowing the risks and feel like the deaths are also on his hand. The last act of the game, we do learn some key things. Set piece boss battles are the highlight of this. First with Vulture and Electro, taking them down from the sky. And then secondly with Rhino and Scorpion. These are really fun, and I feel like the designs for literally all these villains are some of the best in any adaptation. But these fights are too short and easy, and placed in one section of the game. Due to the story they're telling, I understand why they couldn't, but I feel like having them more spread out through the whole game would have been beneficial. We also get really interesting Scorpion hallucination sequence, and another sequence playing as Miles where he's chased by Rhino, which I actually really enjoyed how intimidating and dangerous it made Rhino and his presence. Playing as MJ, we infiltrate Norman's apartment and learn a lot about Norman and the whole situation in general. Harry never went to Europe, he's sick same as his mother and was undergoing treatment. A secret room reveals a lot of information about all of this, and Devil's Breath really is a way of attempting to cure Harry. Also, a spider attaches onto MJ and eventually will bite Miles, setting up his own game in the sequel. The new MacGuffin for this third act is the cure for Devil's Breath. Oscorp has very conveniently been able to develop in time, and you would think Lee and Otto's point had been made by the initial release of Devil's Breath, but of course they can't let Osborn come in as the savior. We stop Lee again and go out to fight Otto, who has taken Norman prisoner and seeks to kill him. And Peter uses all of the work he's done with Otto to upgrade his own suit to work against Otto. A very emotional fight ensues between Otto and Peter feels betrayed when Otto reveals he knew he was Spider-Man all along. The arc for Otto and Peter I feel is absolutely the best thing about this game. The way they appreciate each other and look to each other for help and guidance, and as that slowly disintegrates. Not just because of Otto's health and influence of the arms, but also because Peter is so caught up in the other plots taking part around him. He isn't able to dedicate enough time to Peter and his relationship. The first section of the game, Peter chooses to take down Fisk and help the city instead of sort out his rent situation. A chronic problem he has is to always pick Spider-Man over Peter, and here it comes back to bite him horribly. He doesn't have enough time to sort out the problems in his life, and will always choose Spider-Man, leading to struggling relationships with Otto, MJ, and almost everything in his life. In his quest to do better, the final confrontation is a spectacle, but also very emotional, and as Peter used all his tech and thinking, particularly with motivation of how sick Devil's Breath has made May. For Norman and his outcome, the game brilliantly depicts Norman as a villain, but not an insane one in the same way Otto or even Lee. They let their vengeance cloud their judgment, just putting the burden and pain onto everyone else, while Norman isn't interested in hurting random people, at least yet, and is motivated by love. His love for his wife and his love for Harry, and what's pushing him to run the risks of developing something like Devil's Breath, or the accident that caused Lee's powers. And if I may make a prediction for Spider-Man 2, we know the symbiote is likely to come from Osborn and to be involved with Harry, and it's seeming like Harry is the most likely person to actually be Venom. This honestly would be the perfect cause to Norman's descent into the Green Goblin to be the primary villain, either at the end of Spider-Man 2 like Otto was in this game, or ideally for me, a potential third game. A slow build up to Norman Osborn, the powerful billionaire and crime tycoon, to the maniacal and violent Green Goblin. The game largely ends in the same way it begins, Peter having to choose between what's good for him and good for everyone. This time the stakes are much more dire. May is on the verge of death, and the anti-serum can either be used to save her now, or she will die, while the serum is reproduced and used to save everyone. May reveals she's known Peter is Spider-Man for a long time and how proud of him she is. May represents what Peter ideals to be like. You help someone, you help everyone, is a quote ascribed to her throughout the game, and May represents why Peter is such an important character. He is the product of the people and world around him. Uncle Ben and Aunt May represent the ideals he strives for to be a better person, to help as many people as he can to be Spider-Man and to change the world. Which is why it's so painful for him to act on the ideal she taught him, to sacrifice her for everyone else. Superheroes' place within media has been a constant since the 1930s. They are in essence modern day mythologies. Icons of Batman, Superman, Spider-Man and others are our modern day King Arthurs and Robin Hoods. They aren't highbrow media, and that particularly is why they're so important. The themes are straightforward and obvious. The characters stick to their traits, while these stories can often be distracted by the spectacle, but more than anything they are an ideal. And Peter in this game represents why. His sheer determination to always do the right thing, to do right by others. Anyone can pitch themselves under the mask of Spider-Man, or to have the powers. That's less important than what you do with that power. And that's the important part of a character like Spider-Man. As simple as it might be, these stories are for anyone, at any age, at any time in their life, to be able to resonate with the ideals here. To be a better person, to help others, to be greater. Of course, after the main story and base content, this game got some DLC. This came through one package called The City That Never Sleeps, and was separated into 3 chapters, each focusing on a different main character to Peter. For the first episode, The Heist, we learn all about this version of Felicia Hardy, aka the Black Cat. Seemingly a couple months after the first main game, we find out that by Fisk and the demons and the events of the game, there's now a bit of a power vacuum that different families of the Mafia want to make use of. This is where Black Cat comes in. We find out she's working for Hammerhead and one of the family, but supposedly she's only doing it for him because otherwise he'll kill her son, which Peter thinks could be his. And this information is really the core motivator for this episode. This causes Peter to obviously be overinvested in the situation, causes MJ to be as well, as the slight rift in their relationship opening up, which honestly feels redundant due to the whole main game being about working through a lot of their issues. Each DLC comes with some new stuff though, new crimes through the Mafia ones, which unlike the base game have some new ways of handling it, such as through more puzzles similar to the base game and Peter's spider robot, new challenges through Screwball, which I will say are less simple than the Taskmaster ones, even if Screwball is way more annoying. And particularly helping one supposed police officer find missing paintings the original Black Cat, Felicia's father Walter Hardy, stole in his youth. This has a really great payoff, as the police officer turns out to be deceiving Spider-Man and is actually Walter Hardy, wanting the artwork he stole back. Other ones like the Magia bases and Hammerhead crimes in later episodes each has enough new content not to feel completely redundant and doesn't overdo how much there is. Overall, I would say the DLC offers a good amount in base content. This part was really intriguing to me, but there also came with a number of missed opportunities, particularly as Felicia thinks her father is dead, but he's not, and instead of being an actual motivating element to Felicia and Peter's story, it's literally just side content that isn't really utilized in this chapter or this story. Felicia, on the other hand, is so well crafted. The look is modernized, and while I would like a touch of fur somewhere on the suit, I think she looks and moves great here, agile and purposeful, seemingly most of the time having the upper hand on Spidey. But her character and her mannerisms are perfect in this. She's always one step ahead, overly flirtatious, and has fun and plays with Spidey or whoever in every encounter, all while being manipulating to everyone to achieve her own goals. Felicia is one of my favourite characters in the Spider-Man mythos, and outside of the 90s cartoon, I don't feel we've ever really gotten a great adaptation of the character. Until here, that is. My one gripe is that it feels like it just starts really get going into her and her relationship with Peter, and then it just stops. As well as the reference to a previous relationship between Peter and Felicia, it also appears Peter knows Black Cat is Felicia Hardy, but she appears not to know his identity. It's not really confirmed, but the way she acts make it appear like she only knows him as Spider-Man. So if that's the case, and Peter thinks there's a chance her son is his, does that mean he left the mask on the whole time? Anyway, the chapter comes to an end as Peter and Felicia find a vault where they believe her son is, but of course he's not there because, well, he doesn't exist. Instead, there was a drive there, combined with the others that Felicia has been stealing for Hammerhead, but secretly keeping will give her access to the Mafia's family secrets. The fact that Felicia was simply just using Peter and she had no son was painfully obvious through this entire story. And I get Peter is meant to be a bit naive and too good for his own good, but it definitely gets to a bit of a borderline point in this story. She appears to be dead at the end of the episode, but this obviously isn't the case. The second chapter is marketed around Hammerhead, who is the primary antagonist throughout the whole thing, but really I would say this chapter focuses on Yuri. And Yuri is someone who desperately needed some character. She's more of a device used throughout the main game, and while good performance and writing help, here she is given an actual arc, as we focus on Hammerhead having a vendetta against the police, and particularly her, having to watch him kill her men in cold blood. Hammerhead is after the control of all the crime in the city, and going after saber weapons, particularly one called Project Olympus. This comes to a head at the end of the chapter, when Hammerhead in some sable gear throws down with Spidey, and Yuri ends up seemingly killing him in cold blood after Spidey has beaten him down, leading her to be suspended from the Force. Of course, Hammerhead is revived, ready for the third chapter. The third chapter focuses on Silver Sable, who had a short but strong arc in the main game, and her role here reinforces it. After the main game and being inspired by Spider-Man to help others, she's gone to a homeland of Sincaria to help topple a dictator there. But Hammerhead in New York stealing her weapons has made things harder and pissed her off. She comes back for him. And most of this chapter is really just about getting Silver Sable to trust and work with Spidey, which honestly feels incredibly forced and repetitive of their relationship from the base game, and feels like it just draws things out. An interesting side content here is investigating crimes left of victims of a Magia informer, which ends up with Spidey finding the informer's body and Yuri calling him to tell him that she did this. She doesn't believe in the system anymore and is becoming her own violent vigilante. Obviously set up for the sequel, and I'm really intrigued to see where this goes. Spidey's closest professional relationship also going down a dark path. Hammerhead gets a robot body from Project Olympus, and by god do I hate this. It not only looks absolutely stupid, but I feel the main villains and even secondary ones in the base game had a bit more to them than just power. Also, the point of Hammerhead and his whole mafia shtick is the fact that he is small potatoes compared to the big guys, like Doc Ock or even someone like Electro. And trying to make him a weird robot man feels so out of place and forced. Spidey dealing with the actual relationships and politics of the mafia families honestly is a way more interesting concept than whatever the hell they decide to do with Hammerhead here. Black Cat comes to save Spidey and leaves. They kind of give closure to their arc in the relationship here, which is fine, but given how much I love Black Cat and this iteration, I really hope she gets a prominent role in the sequel, and not just another DLC. I feel like Black Cat as a playable character would honestly make a lot of sense and be unique in this series of games. Development between Peter and Miles happens, particularly through phone calls. Miles learning about how and why Peter does certain things, and while these were cool, I was initially disappointed as it felt half-baked, and that we were going to skip over it and get to the sequel where Miles was already really proficient in being Spider-Man. But, knowing now, and having experienced his own game where Miles goes through his learning phase, these phone calls are a really great way to lead into it. Overall, I feel like the DLC starts fairly decently in the first chapter. The characterization of Felicia is great and the mystery is intriguing, but overall just goes on a downward spiral. And by the third episode, the writing is a dramatic drop from the quality in the base game and Miles Morales. This Spider-Man game is a triumph for Insomniac. Not only do they understand the core tenets of the character, they bring it to the forefront and have their own unique spin on the Spider-Man mythos, and continue to engage and involve it. From gameplay to story and characters, everything in this game feels purposeful to represent who this Spider-Man is, the world he inhabits, and to of course make you feel like Spider-Man. The game does leave room for improvement though, with many improvements in web slinging and combat already visible in the trailers for Spider-Man 2, or experienced through the Miles Morales game. I do think more variation of Spidey's rogues to be used throughout the game would have been nice, as I felt between Shocker and the Sinister Six, it was all just Lee and the demons. This is really disappointing when there are so many rogues and characters to use, and even a fair amount of the ones that were utilised were underutilised. Also, the DLC was a huge step down from the base game, and if there's going to be more DLC in the sequel, more focus and quality in the writing has to be at the utmost importance. Overall, the character of Peter and Spider-Man drive this game through its core focus, the narrative. Swinging around and beating up bad guys makes this game engaging and replayable, but the story is what makes this game special. The arcs the characters go through, the tangible effect it has on the world and activities, and the journey the player goes through as Spider-Man, emphasizing more than anything how great a superhero like Spider-Man is. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave a like as it helps the channel grow, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this interpretation and game about Spider-Man. So leave those in the comments. And are you excited for the sequel? Please subscribe if you want to see more. I'm of course working on a video for Miles Morales, and hopefully Spider-Man 2 once that releases. And until next time, cheers and have a good one.